Did you hear that sound? It might have echoed in the depths of a cave in Spain 430,000 years ago, because this is the sound of perhaps the oldest murder in history.
This skull you see on the screen lay in a pit of bones for tens of thousands of years, along with 27 other individuals. And these two holes on its forehead were not caused by a fall or an accident. Scientists are almost certain this person was struck with the same object to the face twice. Not once, but twice. Was it a moment of rage, a fight, or the beginning of something darker? This simple question opens the door to the giant question that troubles us all. When did we humans begin to kill one another? Today we will embark on humanity's most disturbing yet fascinating journey. We will go to a world without armies, flags, or even kings, and we will seek the answer to that most fundamental question: when did war begin? War did not appear in an instant. It was the result of a process spanning hundreds of thousands of years, of small sparks, dark instincts, and perhaps a few bright ideas. It is a complex dance of our biology, our psychology, and our technology. So let's go back to the beginning, to that gray area where it all started. To understand the path to war, we must first ask the most basic question: is violence in our nature? For the answer, we need to look at two primate species that are genetically almost equidistant to us: chimpanzees and bonobos. Their behaviors are like night and day. The legendary primatologist Jane Goodall proved how strategic and ruthless chimpanzees can be. Male chimpanzee groups regularly patrol the borders of their territories. The purpose of these patrols is not just to find food. It is also a show of force and intelligence gathering. And if they see a lone defenseless male from a neighboring clan, they silently lie in ambush, and with overwhelming numerical superiority, attack and kill him with incredible brutality. Their goal is not to steal his food, not to take his female. There is only one goal: to eliminate a potential rival and secure the genetic legacy of their own clan. This is not a random fight. It is planned. It is strategic. It is a primitive form of war. But there is another side to the coin: bonobos. This species, living south of the Congo River, has a matriarchal social structure unlike chimpanzees. They usually resolve conflicts not with violence but with social bonds, play, and even sexuality, reminiscent of the motto, "Make love, not war." The organized and deadly raids we see in chimpanzees are not found among them. So which one are we, the aggressive chimpanzee or the peaceful bonobo? The answer is probably both. Within us lies the potential for both cooperation and peaceful coexistence, as well as the potential for forming groups and using violence against the other. It's like two different social programs in our hardware. Which program runs is determined by conditions, culture, and resources. So what story do the fossil records of our ancestors tell us? For millions of years, during the long period when species like Homo habilis or Homo erectus walked the planet, there is almost no evidence of systematic violence. Of course, there are traces of predator attacks on bones and fractures from accidents, but finding a trace of them killing each other in an organized manner is nearly impossible. So why? There are a few possible reasons. First, population density was very low. They were in small, scattered groups across the planet, and the probability of even encountering another group was low. Second, they had a nomadic lifestyle. When they had a disagreement with another group, the simplest solution was not to fight, but to move to another valley. The planet was big, and resources were plentiful. Fleeing made more sense than fighting. This suggests to us that war is not an inevitable part of being human, but a result of conditions that arose later. For millions of years, our ancestors perhaps lived largely in peace. So what broke that peace? About 70,000 years ago, something changed within our species, Homo sapiens. During this period, which historians call the cognitive revolution, our brains gained the ability for abstract thought, planning, and most importantly, creating imagined realities, gods, myths, and tribal spirits. It was this ability that opened the door to the path of war all the way. These tiny 100,000-year-old seashells you see are one of the first proofs of this revolution. What were they for? They didn't feed, they didn't help in hunting, they were a message, an identity card. The person wearing these beads was actually saying, "I belong to this group. We are the ones who wear these beads. The spirit of our clan is represented by this symbol." The moment you start saying us, you automatically create a them. Those with different beads, who paint their faces differently, who bury their dead differently. They are no longer just other people, they were strangers. This ability allowed us to cooperate on an unprecedented scale. Hundreds or even thousands of people could act together because they believed in the same myth and the same tribal spirit. This was something other human species like Neanderthals could never achieve. But there was a dark side to the same coin. If you can unite thousands of people for a cause, you can also unite them to fight against another group. War was no longer just a fight for resources, but could also be fought for abstract reasons like, our god is superior to their god. The relatively stable climate of hundreds of thousands of years was upended about 15,000 years ago. The Ice Age was ending. Glaciers were melting, sea levels were rising, and the planet was entering a chaotic warming process. This was a turning point for humanity. It was the end of Eden. This climate change made the environment our ancestors lived in unrecognizable. While much of Africa became arid, river valleys like the Nile turned into oases of life. Different tribes were forced to take refuge in these narrow and fertile corridors to survive. The population suddenly concentrated in certain spots. Pressure on resources increased, and there was nowhere left to run. Tension was inevitable. And the most bitter proof of this tension lies in Jebel Sahaba, near the Egyptian border. The 61 individuals in this 14,000-year-old cemetery were the victims of this chaotic period. More than half of the skeletons had stone points embedded in their bones, spear wounds, and broken bones. This was a massacre. But later, detailed analyses revealed a much darker picture. Some skeletons had both fatal unhealed wounds as well as older healed wounds. What does this mean? These people had been subjected to violence repeatedly throughout their lives. This was not a one-time battle. It was the bitter proof of years, perhaps generations, of reciprocal raids, ambushes, and revenge attacks. We are no longer talking about individual fights, but about intergroup, continuous, and ritualized violence. Jebel Sahaba may be the oldest known crime scene of organized war. About 10,000 years ago, one of the greatest revolutions in human history occurred: agriculture. Instead of chasing game, we began to sow and reap the land. This revolution gave us cities, civilization, and our world today. But it was also the spark that lit the fuse of war. We could also call it the curse of the land. Why? Because for the first time, people had a lot to lose, and these things were immovable. If you are a hunter-gatherer, your most valuable assets are your knowledge and your tools. But if you are a farmer, your field, your harvest, your seeds, your house, your animals, all of it is your everything. These could be both stolen and needed to be defended. The concept of property was born, and once property emerged, so did the desire to protect it and to seize that of others. Furthermore, agriculture led to a population explosion. More food meant more people. Villages grew and borders with neighboring villages became closer. There was no longer anywhere to run. Disputes over land and water resources became deadly. We see the brutality of this period in the mass graves in Europe. In the Talheim death pit in Germany, 7,000 years ago, 34 people were brutally killed with stone axes and thrown into a ditch. This was not an exception. Another mass grave was found nearby in Schöneck-Kilianstadten. Here the victims' legs had been systematically broken, probably so they couldn't escape. These massacres show us a new type of war: total annihilation. The goal is no longer just to repel the enemy. The goal is to wipe an entire village, an entire lineage, off the map. We can even see the genetic traces of this brutality. In an event called the Y chromosome bottleneck, between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, 90% of the male lineages on the planet suddenly disappeared. For every 17 women living at that time, there was only one man. This was the genetic echo of a brutal, generations-long war where winning clans killed all the men of the losers and took their women. This fear also changed architecture. Massive walls were built, like in Jericho. Cities like Çatalhöyük in Turkey turned into virtual fortresses. War was now a part of life.
Agriculture brought about something else: surplus product. That is, more food than was necessary for everyone to survive. This led to the birth of inequality within society. Some families acquired more land and wealth, and to protect this wealth, they needed something new: specialists. First came new weapons. The discovery of copper and then bronze by mixing it with tin was a revolution in the history of war. A bronze sword was far more lethal than a stone axe. A bronze helmet could protect the skull from being shattered. But bronze was expensive. It was not something everyone could own. Only the wealthiest and most powerful segment of society, the newly emerging elite class, could afford these weapons and armor. Thus, the warrior class was born. War ceased to be an event in which the whole tribe participated and turned into an art managed and executed by these elite warriors. Along with these warriors, a new ideology emerged: the cult of heroism. Fighting was no longer just a necessity, but also a way to gain fame, honor, and immortality. Heroes like Achilles, described in Homer's Iliad, were the symbols of this new ideal. For the first time, war began to be glorified. Growing cities, increasing population and wealth necessitated a new form of organization: the state. Kings, taxes, laws, and bureaucracy. The state was an organizational machine that made war more efficient and deadly than ever before. The clearest evidence of this change is the Stele of the Vultures from Sumer. On this stone tablet from about 4,500 years ago, we see an army for the first time in history. The soldiers all wear the same helmet, carry the same shields, and walk in a tight formation called a phalanx. This is not an angry mob. This is a disciplined, trained, organized killing machine. The first professional army in history. And finally, war turned into a bureaucracy. Most of the first written tablets found in Mesopotamia are accounting records, and among those boring lists, we see items like food rations given to the armed men. That was the moment everything changed. War was now a budget item. It had turned into a job with a salary paid and rations provided by the state. Writing was used not only to keep ration lists, but also for propaganda. Kings inscribed their victories on monuments and denigrated their enemies. War was no longer just an action, but also a tool for the state to legitimize and strengthen itself. When it became an institution, it turned into a self-sustaining monster. So, what was the first great stage where all these elements, an ambitious leader, a professional army, complex logistics, state propaganda, and the power of writing, came together? What did the first battle described to us by history in full detail look like? For this, we need to set our time machine to 1458 BC, to ancient Egypt. On the stage is a young and ambitious pharaoh, Thutmose III. Against him is a coalition of Syrian and Canaanite city-states led by the Prince of Kadesh, wanting to take advantage of Egypt's weakness. This coalition threatened to cut off the trade routes for tin, vital for Egypt's bronze weapons, and wood for its chariots. For Thutmose, this was not just a border skirmish, but a war to reassert Egypt's superpower status. Thutmose gathered his army of over 10,000 soldiers and marched across the Sinai Desert towards the enemy's fortress, the city of Megiddo. It is here that we understand war is no longer just about brute force. There were 3 roads to Megiddo. His generals recommended the 2 wide and open roads where the army could advance safely, but Thutmose chose the 3rd road, the narrow, ambush-prone, and dangerous Aruna Pass. Why? Because this road would take him directly to the foot of the enemy city. This was no longer the age of tribal chiefs, but of commanders who analyzed risks and aimed to surprise the enemy. This was the age of strategy. Thutmose overruled his generals and, based on the divine authority he received from the god Amun-Ra, he personally led his army into that dangerous pass. In the army, there were not only soldiers. There were pack animals carrying disassembled chariots and officials carrying supplies, and perhaps most importantly, a scribe holding a papyrus scroll. This scribe would record this campaign and the coming battle in history, thus immortalizing the pharaoh's victory. Thutmose's gamble paid off. The enemy coalition was caught off guard.
not expecting the Egyptian army to emerge from that narrow pass. When they met on the plain of Megiddo, the discipline and superior organization of the Egyptian army showed itself. Light and agile chariots broke through the enemy lines, while archers, supported by Nubian mercenaries, and infantry using sickle swords, khopesh, crushed the enemy. The battle was turning into a crushing victory for Egypt when a human factor came into play: greed. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy and capturing the city, the Egyptian soldiers began to plunder the spoils on the battlefield. Chariots adorned with gold and silver, horses, weapons. This chaos allowed the Prince of Kadesh and other commanders to escape inside the walls of Megiddo. Victory suddenly turned into a siege. Thutmose had his army surround the city with a ditch and a wall of fresh timber, condemning them to starvation. After a siege lasting months, Megiddo surrendered. But the most important outcome of this war was not the victory won on the battlefield. The real victory was the inscriptions carved on the walls of the Karnak temple in Thebes. The notes taken by that scribe turned into the first detailed account of a battle in history. The list of spoils captured in the battle: 924 chariots, over 2,000 horses, hundreds of prisoners, and 83 hands proudly collected from the dead, was meticulously recorded. War was no longer just an event, but data that was recorded, measured, listed, and turned into a propaganda tool. Thutmose didn't just win a battle, he had his own heroic myth written. This was the first proof that war was now fought not only for land and resources, but also to be in the history books, that is, for immortality. So, when did war begin? As you can see, there is no single simple answer to this question. War did not start in a day. It emerged when a series of materials accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years ignited under the right conditions. First, we had our biological potential for both cooperation and intergroup violence. Then, with the cognitive revolution, we acquired the mental tools to create us and them. The climate chaos at the end of the Ice Age forced us to compete for resources. The agricultural revolution created property to die for and land to defend. The rise of inequality gave birth to a warrior elite class. And finally, the state brought all these elements together, turning war into an organized, permanent, and more deadly institution than ever before. And as we saw at Megiddo, writing immortalized this institution. The moment war was carved onto the wall of a temple, it was no longer just a disaster, but also a source of pride for a civilization, a king's greatest legacy. We not only invented it as a cultural technology, but we also glorified it by writing it on the most glorious pages of our history. Do you know what the strangest part is? We Homo sapiens are the most cooperative species on this planet. We cooperate by the billions to build giant cities, go to space, and create incredible works of art. But at the same time, we are the only species that systematically and massively destroys its own kind. Perhaps the true origin of war is hidden right in the middle of these two contradictions. At the moment, we decided to use our ability to cooperate to destroy one another. Thank you for joining me on this journey. What do you think about these dark and complex shadows of the past? Is war inevitable, or is it a technology we can one day leave behind? I would be really happy if you share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next video. For now, goodbye.